You all know that now very famous comment about that Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she did it backwards, wearing high heels. You know, it's a fabulous line. Well, that's Kath Hicks. You know, this is a woman that, while she was raising in just an active young family and working full time, went off to get a PhD from a frontline school. I don't know how the hell you do that. So, and it's clearly the obvious reason why the President and the Secretary asked Kath to become the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And she has been at the center of all of the primary deliberations that have been underway. And they've been very important deliberations, how we're going to recast America's footprint at a time where we have significant financial stress, things of this nature. She's been right in the middle of it. She's been leading that policy discussion. So when we we needed to have a framework and the administration's voice on this question, there was no better person than to ask than Dr. Kathleen Hicks. And so would you please welcome her with your applause? Let me just say one thing. Yes, yeah, please applaud. And I forgot to say this earlier. The way we're going to do Q&A in this session, we're going to ask you to write them down on cards. We'll be collecting them, and then Mike and David Berteau are going to be aggregating and make sure that we've got quality questions, because we have a very short period of time. We have to be done by 1:15. So let me turn to you, Kath. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me today. Dr. Hamre failed to mention that I used to work at CSIS, so I'm quite familiar with the scene here and with the great team. So thank you very much, John, of course, for that kind introduction. And again, it's a pleasure for me to be back at CSIS with so many friends and former colleagues. I am particularly pleased to be here today to present the DoD perspective on what I think is a really excellent piece of work that CSIS has produced in the form of this congressionally mandated assessment of U.S. defense posture in Asia. I want to thank David Berteau and Mike Green in particular for producing such a discerning study under pressing constraints, not least of which had to be the 3-month study timeline that you had. And I have no doubt with this and many of the other constraints that you faced, you had several Serenity Now moments during the production of this report, and I congratulate you on a job well done. I understand you've already had a very rich and full discussion this morning on issues related to U.S. presence and posture in the Asia-Pacific region. So I will attempt to keep my prepared remarks brief and allow us to spend some of our time on questions and answers. This afternoon, I'll sketch out some of the key tenets of the Defense Strategic Guidance and its implications for U.S. defense relationships, activities, presence, and posture in the Asia-Pacific. I will then talk about what we're doing in DoD to implement or resource the rebalance and conclude with some thoughts on our way ahead. So let me start by providing a little strategic context. Throughout much of 2011, the senior leadership of the Defense Department, along with the President and his staff, was engaged in a strategic review of how to achieve the objectives of the National Defense Strategy amid changes in the geostrategic and resource environments. The end of the war in Iraq and the onset of our transition to Afghan leadership for security and Operation Enduring Freedom were among the dynamics that we felt necessitated a relook prior to the next QDR. President Obama announced our new defense strategic guidance in January of this year at the Pentagon. The guidance is nested under the objectives laid out in the 2010 National Security Strategy and the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, along with the imperative to continue renewing American leadership so that we can more effectively advance our interests in the 21st century. It succinctly and clearly prioritizes our approaches and missions within these broader frameworks. One of those approaches is rebalancing toward the Asia-Pacific. But let's be mindful that it is not the only one. The department's strategy also entails investing in a joint force that, though smaller and leaner, will be more agile, flexible, ready, and technologically advanced. Ensuring U.S. forces will be capable of deterring and defeating aggression by any potential adversary anytime, anywhere. no longer sizing our forces for long, protracted, troop-intensive counterinsurgency and stability operations, and protecting key investments in the technologies and capabilities most appropriate for the future security environment. Moreover, even within our regional rebalance, the Department is committed to continued emphasis on the Middle East, developing capabilities in and with Europe appropriate to address future security challenges, and seeking to strengthen our defense relationships and be the security partner of choice globally. The Department has and will continue to evaluate how best to allocate defense resources across all the regions where the United States has security responsibilities. But for now, I'd like to focus my time on Asia. In the last couple of months alone, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Panetta, and Deputy Secretary Ash Carter have each visited Asia, with Secretary Panetta having just concluded his trip to Japan, China, and New Zealand. These travels provide our leaders the venue to describe the United States' vision for a prosperous and peaceful Asia-Pacific, supported by a shared commitment to the values of free and open commerce, unimpeded access to the global commons, and a system based on the rule of law. This vision spans the spectrum of our diplomatic, economic, and defense policies. Our whole-of-government efforts include strengthening our alliances and partnerships, deepening working relationships with emerging powers, engaging in and strengthening multilateral institutions, expanding trade and investment, and advancing principles of democracy and human rights. The investment of time and resources that the entire U.S. government is making in our relationship in this region includes a strong emphasis on improving relations with China. This is particularly important, as President Obama, Secretaries Clinton and Panetta, and Deputy Secretary Carter have made absolutely clear. The rebalance is not just about China, it is not just about the U.S. role in the region, and it is not an attempt by the U.S. to contain China. Rather, the rebalance is about the entire region, including U.S. engagement with China, including military-to-military relations, as the United States, expands its role, as does China, in the Asia-Pacific. The stability and prosperity of this region will be shaped by our ability to work together. Let me offer a few examples of the investments of time and resources the Defense Department is making in the Asia-Pacific region in support of the overall USG effort, focusing on posture in accordance with the emphasis of this conference. As U.S. forces return from Afghanistan and reset globally, one of our top priorities is having forces present and positioned in the Pacific to assure regional allies and partners, deter threats to regional stability, and prevail in conflicts if necessary. This includes the Army aligning specific forces to U.S. Pacific Command, as well as the return of Marine Corps units to the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. We are also shifting our overall naval presence to the Asia-Pacific region. As Secretary Panetta stated at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June, we intend to have 60% of our naval assets based in the Pacific by 2020, a substantial historical shift. We will have in the Pacific a net increase of 1 aircraft carrier, 4 Burke-class destroyers, 3 Zumwalt-class destroyers, 10 littoral combat ships, and 2 submarines. The Department continues to work with our allies and partners in the region to increase the number and size of bilateral and multilateral exercises. For example, just a few weeks ago, and for the first time, Indonesian Soiku participated alongside Thai, U.S., and Australian fighters in the biannual exercise Pitch Black in Australia's Northern Territory. Our exercises and training with allied and partner militaries are central to the United States remaining the security partner of choice in the region, while encouraging others to share the burden. Our forward presence and engagement play an essential role in strengthening the capabilities of Pacific nations to defend and secure themselves. Building strong partnerships in the Asia-Pacific region requires us to sustain and enhance American military strength there. Modernizing and strengthening our bilateral alliances and partnerships in the region is essential, from working with our stalwart treaty allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, and Thailand, to cementing our partnerships with India, Singapore, Indonesia, and other nations, to developing healthy, stable, reliable relations with China. In addition to our commitment to bilateral relationships, we are committed to improving the region's collective security capacity and supporting efforts by ASEAN to foster greater regional defense cooperation. Last October in Bali, Secretary Panetta became the first U.S. Secretary of Defense to meet privately with all ASEAN defense ministers. And we are active participants in the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, especially through its action-oriented experts working groups. We are also helping increase regional capacity to respond to natural disasters, and we support regional efforts to resolve peacefully territorial disputes in the South China Sea. As you've heard, I'm sure, during the course of the morning panels, U.S. forward defense posture also plays an important role in the Department's efforts to shape the security environment in Asia. Shortly after this administration came into office in 2009, it began to lay the intellectual foundation for the importance of U.S. forward presence and posture and how best to develop it in key regions. The 2010 QDR outlined the core elements that continue to inform how we are pursuing enhancements to our posture in the Asia-Pacific. This is a posture that is geographically distributed, operationally resilient, and politically sustainable throughout the region. In the coming years, the Department will modernize U.S. basing arrangements with traditional allies in Northeast Asia, continue to build up Guam as a strategic hub in the Western Pacific, and expand access to locations in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean region. These initiatives include necessary near-term investments to establish fully capable marine air-ground task forces in Okinawa, Guam, Australia, and Hawaii, plans to deploy up to 4 littoral combat ships to Singapore, plans to increase the rotational deployment of U.S. Air Force units in northern Australia, and continuing to pursue opportunities with our Philippine allies to rotationally deploy U.S. forces to priority areas. Supporting all of these planned and potential posture changes are enhancements to U.S. training ranges in the region. Investments in training ranges in Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, and potentially other areas will enhance U.S. joint training opportunities as well as combined training opportunities with our allies and partners. As the CSIS assessment finds, investments in these training ranges are necessary to maintain the readiness and operational capability of our forces. They will also play a significant role in supporting our efforts to enhance interoperability and build the capacity of regional allies and partners across a range of military missions, including operations in anti-access and area denial environments. With a broader, more diverse posture in the region, U.S. forces will be better positioned than ever to provide support for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, counterterrorism, and other operations that contribute to the well-being and stability of this critical region. As a Pacific nation, the United States will maintain an enduring defense presence in the Asia-Pacific region that provides tangible reassurance of our commitment to Asia's security, economic development, and the prosperity essential to continued growth both within the region and globally. The Department's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region has not been rhetoric without resourcing. Rather, we've demonstrated our commitment to sustain and, in some cases, quicken the pace of U.S. defense engagement and capabilities development for this vital region. If the United States is to remain a credible security partner, we must be able to retain our unique capability to project military power in defense of common interests. In parallel with our enhancements to our defense posture, the Department is also making key capability investments that undergird our efforts to rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific region. Steps include investment and development of a new penetrating bomber and long-range prompt conventional strike systems, the sustainment of the Navy's carrier fleet and their associated air wings, and investment in a variety of resiliency initiatives. Pursuing these and other capabilities appropriate to projecting power and ensuring freedom of maneuver in this critical region offers the best prospect for protecting U.S. interests not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but also elsewhere in the world. Today and into the future, the United States faces security challenges across the globe. As we look to implement our rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific region, we are mindful of pressing priorities elsewhere in the world and across the defense program, all of which compete for scarce defense resources. The fiscal year 2013 President's budget request provides an initial set of investments toward fulfilling the Defense Strategic Guidance's vision for the Joint Force of 2020, including enhanced defense capabilities and activities in the Asia-Pacific region. However, fully realizing these plans for future defense activities, presence, and posture in Asia will not happen in one budget cycle. The Department has established new processes and focused senior leader attention to ensure the rebalance is reflected in the force structure decisions we make, in new investments we're making in technology and weapon systems, in innovative operational plans, concepts, and tactics, and in our relationships, activities, posture, and presence in the region. These last two measures of our rebalance, the way we think, train, and fight, and the relationships on which we rely, deserve particular attention. They are so often overlooked and can take many years to fully develop, but they are central to our success. The Department is already shifting significant weight to understanding how to operate in or gain access to denied areas, and will need to build complementary operational concepts as well as language and cultural expertise to operate effectively in this region. Likewise, we are heavily invested in building capacity with our Asia-Pacific and international partners to help us achieve mutual security objectives in peacetime and crisis. This is a segue to the thought I would like to conclude with today, and that is to underscore that the Department of Defense is mindful of our supporting role in helping secure U.S. national interests in this and all regions. The rebalance toward the Asia-Pacific is by definition a whole-of-government imperative. Our goal in crafting the Defense Strategic Guidance, last year's President's budget, and future budget submissions was and will continue to be the development and resourcing of a future joint force that will be agile, flexible, and ready to play its role in achieving U.S. national security objectives, including those in the Asia-Pacific. In Asia, that means resourcing the rebalance so that our joint force, combined with the diplomatic and development tools of statecraft, provide the President with options to guarantee continued American global leadership and leadership in the region. Let me just close by thanking again CSIS for bringing much needed attention to this issue, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
All right, if you have questions, cards that you've filled out with questions, just hold them up. We got staff who will come around and collect them and bring them to us. They've been instructed to continue collecting them, so as you think of additional questions, you can hold them up as well. I'm confident there will be more questions than there is time, but we kind of like it that way because we'll be able to keep going, if you will. We've got a few already here, and I think Mike and I will take turns. You want to take the first one, Mike?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this?
Yes.
We had a question about the geographic distribution of U.S. forces, which appears to be shifting to some extent out of Northeast Asia. And the question is, will this make it more difficult for the United States to fulfill commitments in Northeast Asia to resource operational plans? And does DoD perhaps see less of a risk in Northeast Asia from the traditional major contingencies that drove our force posture?
Thank you very much. There is not a decline planned or even evident in the U.S. force posture in Northeast Asia. Instead, we're really growing our overall force posture in Asia to allow the distribution into Southeast Asia. So the United States will still maintain approximately the size of the force it has now in Korea. We will maintain, as you know, between Guam and Okinawa, the size of the force we had originally intended up there. And our naval activities will again expand rather than contract around Northeast Asia. So really our effort was to make sure we have the best capacity that we can up in that region while expanding our ability to operate really in a much more small footprint way in Southeast Asia.
Dr. Hicks, let me do a follow-on to that. One of the constraints about force posture in Northeast Asia is the constraint over forces on the Korean Peninsula. There's a tendency, at least on the part of the Koreans, to view those as non-deployable elsewhere. How can the U.S. persuade Korea to be more comfortable with U.S. forces being deployed or deployable off the peninsula?
We have been in very active conversations with the Koreans for some time, and I think we have a joint view, a combined view, of the importance of being able to contribute to regional stability beyond the Korean Peninsula. We have to ensure that we retain in and around the region or able to get there quickly forces that are a credible deterrent. That's incredibly important to both the United States and the Republic of Korea, and we will continue to prioritize that. That said, we do see opportunities with the South Koreans, as well as unilaterally, to use our forces to support areas like humanitarian and disaster relief, and potentially counter-piracy, training operations that can occur off of the peninsula.
Not surprisingly, we've had a couple of questions about the standoff between Japan and China in the Senkaku Islands. One question asks, you can pick and choose. One question asks why China would listen to the U.S. It's made its claim, and why should we expect China to behave differently? The other asks, does DoD have a role in terms of military-to-military engagement to help diffuse the situation?
Thank you very much. The first question, why would China listen to the United States? I think really the issue there is that the stability of the region is in all of our interests, including the Chinese. And I think that we've been able to make that very clear. I think the Chinese likewise understand the long-term interests they have in ensuring stability in the region. As to the mill-to-mill channel, absolutely. That's an area where we believe if we can grow, it's not just with China, it's with all the militaries of the region. If we can grow those military-to-military contacts, we can be a stabilizing force. We can provide a channel of communication that can help defuse situations, and that's front and center in both our engagement with the Chinese, but again, it's with all the militaries of the region.
Let me let my microphone warm up here. There we go. There's this latency effect, if you will. There are a couple of questions on the economic side, because that has come up not only in your talk, but throughout the day so far. One of the questions has to do with sort of who's got the lead in the U.S. government. It's easy to tell who has the lead on the military side. It's easy to tell who has the lead on the diplomatic side. A little harder to tell who has the lead on the economic side. And the second question, actually, there's two of them that have come in on this, is what's the role of the multilateral economic institutions in terms of fostering this kind of regional balance that we're seeking here?
I am a representative of the Defense Department, so I will not venture too far into the territory belonging to others. I think the State Department absolutely has the central role to play in crafting the overall U.S. foreign policy objectives to include the economic objectives for the region. And all of the departments and agencies that can contribute to that, are linked in through the State Department. So I'll leave it at that.
We had a question about the role of our European NATO allies in this rebalance. Is this a compartmented strategy, or do you see a role for our allies in Europe in our rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region?
We see a role for any of our allies that likewise believe that the stability and prosperity of Asia is central to our common and mutual interests. So we have worked closely with our allies in Europe. As I said, the Asia rebalance is not the only part of our strategy. The stability of the Middle East is a continued emphasis on the Middle East is another key piece of our strategy. And there we absolutely do see a combined interest. That is to say that our NATO partners are very interested in the stability of that region. And to the extent that they're able to share burden and work through that area with us, it helps the United States and other Pacific-oriented nations shift more emphasis west.
I have one more sort of soft power question, and then I've been storing up the pure DoD questions here for a little bit. On the soft power side, one of the areas of engagement has to do with reactions to disasters, to opportunities for humanitarian assistance, et cetera. How do we take a more proactive role in terms of preparing for and using engagement proactively, more the soft power end of getting ready and cooperating with countries and enhancing our relationships with those nations?
They're often part and parcel of the same tools. That is to say, when we go about combined exercises, they may be oriented toward response, but they are building, again, those networks of communication, that trust, that understanding for our forces of the region or sub-region in which they're operating, language, routine deployment, of course, is extremely important. As I talked about, the Army thinking through how it will orient itself to the Pacific and other regions through routine redeployment so that there's a continuity, if you will, in the contact. All those base capabilities, those foundational capabilities, help us in the response, collectively us, and they also help us shape really what those institutions, those military institutions, how they think about themselves as part of a rule of law society, as they think about being international actors and taking on more of a role in peacekeeping and elsewhere. So that they're linked. It's very difficult to separate the two because we use the response capability to build the relationships.
We had a question about surface-to-surface missile ranges in Korea, what the department's view is of Korean participation in missile defense, and then a broader related question about capacity, partnership capacity. I think you used the phrase partnership capacity. Does the department have a current or evolving view on what capabilities we think our allies and partners should have? How do we communicate that, and the questioner asked, can you give an example or so of the kind of capacities we think our allies and partners need as we move forward with what you just described for U.S. forces?
Sure. So let me take the second part first, and then I'm going to ask you to remind me on the first part. The second part, the United States absolutely tries to think through with partners. We don't get to rule the world. We think through with our partners and allies what capabilities make the most sense for their and our collective needs. That is ongoing, absolutely routinely with many of our treaty allies. And with other partners, we do that as well, and we actually have some specific programs targeted toward just that when a country is receptive to speaking to the United States about what capability, how it might think about linking strategy to capabilities, and therefore what capabilities might be most important for it to develop. Much of those conversations are obviously private. They're bilateral. It's not for the United States to say publicly what another nation, for the United States government to say publicly what we believe another nation's needs are. But rest assured, that's a very routine part of our interactions, particularly in bilateral senses. So picking some areas that are public, I would say working with the Australians on their investment in subsurface warfare, their counter-mine capability. Those are amphibious capability. Those are areas that really stand out. The Japanese in the United States talk routinely about anti-access and thinking about the kinds of capabilities that make sense and the kind of operating concepts that make sense in anti-access environments. We speak routinely in Southeast Asia. It's a different type of capability. It's about how to build navies that make sense for coastal defense and for operating in and around small islands. Those are some examples. And remind me of the first half of the question.
Yeah, the first part of the question was specifically about Korea and missile defense. Do you see a future where Korea is participating in or contributing to missile defense efforts in the region?
We definitely have a vision, as you all probably know, through our ballistic missile defense review, of a phased adaptive approach that's tailored for Asia, particularly for East Asia. And in that, yes, there are a lot of ways to contribute. One can contribute through radars. It doesn't have to be through active defense itself, or certainly active participation through the use of missiles. So yes, I think we do see we have a dialogue with the Koreans about how to contribute to missile defense. And then in terms of more detailed discussion on missile participation, I'll leave that for others to comment on.
Let me move slightly up the spectrum, not quite yet into the hard power, but getting closer here. I'm merging three questions together here. There's actually three questions. I'll ask them in parallel. What efforts are being taken to provide military capacity with our Asia partners from an economic point of view, trade point of view? This leads to the question of how can we make foreign military sales more responsive and timely? And thirdly, how do we tie FMS and direct sale priorities to U.S. strategy?
In the Defense Department, and obviously this is an area that absolutely spans Defense and State Department. State Department has the lead for foreign military sales and for foreign military financing. We are thinking very, very hard about just this question, which is how to bring together the defense capacity building efforts, including through trade and FMS, but also some of our other authorities. You know, we have a small array of other smaller authorities in DoD, and then of course the GSCF, which we in State Department do together. Trying to bring that in with the with our own sense of how the U.S. should develop capabilities and where the complementarity should be. So FMS and defense sales are a huge piece of that. Secretary Panetta just spoke about this at U.S. Institute for Peace maybe 3 months ago. As I'm sure you, David, know, Dr. Hamre, as the chair of the Defense Policy Board, has brought forward the same type of issue set, and many of our co-coms we raise this routinely and have for years, the need to have a more agile FMS system, the need to be able to use defense trade as an instrument of the strategy, linking the kinds of capabilities we think are needed in the region to the goals that we think should be pursued together. So that's all critical to our strategy. Doing it, as you know, is very, very difficult. The FMS system, first of all, there have been tremendous improvements in the system. The volume of U.S. sales has grown about sixfold, a little more than sixfold in something like 7 years. We're doing much more, a large volume of sales moving through the system faster with fewer people. There's a lot of goodness in there, but it's also tied up in many other issues related to export control, security, to legitimate security concerns the United States has about particular high-end capabilities going into regions. And so there's a lot more, there's a heavy workload left to do there between state and defense working with the Congress.
I have a question here, which is from someone from the region, who asks, is the rebalance premised on the global war on terror, or whatever we call it now, winding down? And if that's the case, what is the new normal for the global war on terror? What's the other side of the coin look like to those in Asia who are trying to understand this rebalancing of resources and effort?
Premised is too strong, in my opinion. We obviously believe that to resource the rebalance effectively, we have to be able to have a marriage of, of a budget environment and the forces available to make that happen. So it's a part of the picture. Our vision of the future, excuse me, with regard to terrorism is, first of all, it's going to continue to be a major part of the spectrum of threat that the United States faces. It's not going to dissipate overnight. We do think Al-Qaeda is extremely weakened, but that doesn't mean there aren't many affiliated groups and other forms or groups for terrorism throughout the world, including in East Asia or Asia more broadly. So our general view is that terrorism will be first of all, whole of government. The DoD's piece of that really can become more small team focused. A lot of ISR emphasis and both soft and general purpose force capability, capacity training to make sure that our security force assistance builds capacity in key regions of the world. So you will see, for instance, the Defense Department is not planning to bring down the size of our Special Operations Force. We believe that force will still be needed in about the size it is today in order to take on the demands. It will just be dispersed differently. Instead of all being in Afghanistan 5 years down the road, hopefully you'll see more dispersion. So I don't think it's premised on it. I do think we have a terrorism demand signal in the future. I think the biggest threat to the rebalance to Asia is, of course, sequestration and anything that would threaten fundamentally our ability to resource the strategy that we have.
Well, that last sentence took
well.
care of 3 other questions here, yes. Dr. Hicks, you mentioned developing capability to access denied areas. Could you elaborate on that? What kind of programs or forces are you looking at as part of that additional capability?
Well, I did speak already about the long-range bomber and the prompt conventional global strike. Those are 2. We very much believe that the United States has an asymmetric advantage in undersea warfare. We'll continue to emphasize that. And resiliency issues, trying to understand how our forces and the forces of our allies and partners can operate inside an already denied environment includes building better resiliency. That can be dispersion of forces. It can be hardening of facilities. And again, more operational concepts that think through how to operate and fight in an environment of that sort without getting into detail on sort of the operational and tactical level. So those are some of the big investment areas that we have. And in addition to that, space and cyber are key emphasis areas for the Defense Department. The Defense Strategic Guidance points to those. We do think there's some ability to leverage those 2 areas to help us in denied environments. And then finally, ISR is always important in order to understand the area in which we're operating more fully.
Last one. We now look at Article 1 of the Constitution instead of Article 2. I know you're a Defense Department representative, but Congress does have a role to play here. We have 3 questions asking essentially what are the next steps in working with the Congress over funding for this realignment, particularly with a focus on the relocation from Okinawa to Guam.
We've had tremendous, first of all, your report has been incredibly helpful in helping us to bridge what was a clear communications gap. So we're very grateful for that. And in the last 6 weeks or so, the Deputy Secretary has engaged personally with several members of Congress to talk through what the remaining issues are. There are remaining issues from the view of the Hill, and we're going to continue to work through those. We do think we will have some ability to expend resources in this coming fiscal year, meaning FY13, not only FY14. But I think we are still working with Congress to ensure that they feel they have fully seen, the vision of what we're trying to pursue, particularly with regard to the Okinawa and Guam moves, in order to allow us to expend all the dollars that we have either already lined up, such as the Government of Japan funds or the United States' own programming. But I do see significant movement over the last 6 weeks, and I'm very hopeful that that's portends a good trajectory.
That's not as positive a note as I think we can hope to end on. I would like you all to please join me in a round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Hicks.